There was a period of about 3 years where my family took yearly vacations to a nearby state park. My dad bought this old RV from a buddy and we'd camp out in that. It was fun when I was younger, but that last year was miserable. I was almost 14 by then. Hanging out with my family was the last thing I wanted to do. It was spring break and all my friends were already going to places like Florida. I did anything I could think of to pass the time. I remember sleeping a lot and going on a lot of walks. I was bored to death sitting around camp waiting for bugs to bite me. I did meet a few girls my age, but they weren't able to hang out much. We'd been cramped up for 4 days when I ran into this cute older guy. He told me his name was Steve and he was 19. A group of his friends had invited him along for the holiday, but they all had to leave early. He'd been spending his days drinking beer and fishing. Being the deceitful and immature child that I was, I lied and told him that I was 17. When he asked if I wanted a beer, I accepted. I never even tasted beer at that age, but I wanted to look cool. We walked through a small clump of trees separating the two camping areas to his tent. He pulled out a can of beer from a cooler and handed it to me. It was so bad that I almost spit it back into his face, but I managed to choke it down. He and I sat at the picnic table and continued our discussion. Although I hated it, I kept drinking the beer. Halfway through the can, I kinda had a buzz going. Of course, at that time, I just knew that I felt really good. The taste began to improve with every sip, and I was drunk by the time I finished the first can. Steve had a fresh beer open and ready for me, and I started taking bigger and bigger drinks as the minutes passed. I was acting like a total idiot. I also began feeling very tired, and I laid my head down and listened while Steve talked, and I guess I must have fallen asleep. I remember raising my head up at one point and saw Steve standing a few feet away talking on his cell phone. I laid my head back down but soon woke up again, feeling sick. It wasn't long before I started throwing up. I was so embarrassed. I kept blaming it on food poisoning, and he was holding my hair back and laughing now. This probably took place over a period of hours but seemed like only minutes, and this is when things started to go south. I was finished puking and in the process of wiping it off my face when a car pulled into the camping spot. I assumed one of his friends had returned. It was starting to get dark and I knew my parents would start missing me. I had left for a hike just after lunch, and now I was terribly embarrassed and just wanted to get away. In my mind, I was sober enough to get past my parents. Steve was at the car talking to another guy about his age, it seemed. I took my chance to slip away. I said goodbye and thanked him for the beers, and he called out to me to wait. He suggested I stay a little longer and have some water so I could sober up some more. He was walking toward me this entire time. I thanked him but said I needed to get back. I could hear my parents calling out for me through the trees at this point. I turned again and got about 3 steps before I felt someone grab me. It was Steve. I asked him what he was doing. He didn't say anything, and I quickly realized that he was dragging me to the car. The other guy had the trunk open and was looking around. I began fighting to get away, but Steve was so strong. The closer to the car I got, the more panicked I became. I could hear the other guy saying, "Hurry up," in a rushed tone. The fear really kicked in now, and I started screaming at the top of my lungs. Anything I could think of. Mommy, Daddy, help, anything. My parents were yelling back at me now. It all must have become too risky for Steve, and I heard him shout some expletive, and then he let me go. I just dropped onto the paved surface of the road, but expected I would soon be grabbed again. I balled up my fist preparing to fight, but when I turned, no one was there, and I sat up in time to see Steve jump into the passenger side of the car. The car sped off with the trunk still open, and a massive feeling of relief washed over me. Then, I emptied my stomach onto the pavement everywhere once more. My dad scooped me up like I was a feather and rushed me back to the camper. It took almost an hour for the sheriffs to arrive. They put out a bulletin or whatever it's called for the car, but it was little help. I knew nothing about cars and I was too busy fighting for my life to get the plate number. Despite my protests, I was taken to the hospital for tests. After I was cleared, we returned home and waited for news. and that would be the last family vacation we'd ever go on. Sleep was hard to come by for a long time. My parents put me in counseling, which did help a lot. It truly did. And the doctor gave me a prescription in case of anxiety attacks, but I didn't need to use it very often. The hardest part was dating. I had trouble being alone around men. The majority of times I went out in groups. Drinking was impossible. The risk of being drugged or taken advantage of was too high. I wouldn't drink alone with a man until my husband and I were married. I'd like to leave you all with an important message. Young women have so much pressure on them these days. It's not just about being pretty. They feel pressure to grow up faster than they need to. And this sometimes leads to poor decisions like the one I made. I'm not going to preach here. I realize you're going to do what you want. But if you do find yourself in a similar position, pay attention to your instincts. They rarely lead you wrong. When the time comes to leave, don't worry about hurting someone's feelings. Get out of there and get to safety. Anybody that doesn't understand doesn't deserve to be your friend. Somewhere about April or May every year, I leave the shop in the hands of my cousin and take a 2-week vacation in the Ozarks. Our family has a 250-acre piece of land that's used for hunting mostly. In my case, I just use it as a getaway from the stresses of modern life. The area has very little in the way of conveniences like electricity. One dirt and gravel road leads in and out. At the end of this road sits a 100-year-old log cabin, and this is where I spend my time. Just me, my thoughts, and the beauty of nature to keep me company. It's a routine I recommend to everyone. I could carry on about how beneficial nature is all day, but that's not why I'm here. I want to share a strange and terrifying incident I had back in 2020 while I was out there. While the rest of the world were hiding away in their homes, Mark, my cousin, and I were working our tails off. Things still needed repairing, and we were the only people in the area willing to fill the demand. Without our employees, we were overwhelmed in no time. When Mark injured his hand, we finally threw up our hands and shut down. The world was going to have to wait until we figured out a way around the lockdowns, and during this period of transition, I decided to take my vacation. A week or two in the woods was just what I needed. I was up late one night reading and heard a faint crack in the distance. It was familiar, but I was unable to place it. I sat quietly and waited for it to happen again, but I didn't hear it. I went back to my book and the rest of the night was quiet. The next day I found myself hiking away from the cabin and came across a dead deer. It clearly hadn't died from natural causes. The body had been hastily skinned and butchered. A lot of good meat had been wasted, and it made my blood boil. And not just because of the horrible harvesting. Any hunter reading this knows July is way out of hunting season. It appeared we had a poaching problem on our land. I snapped a few photos on my phone to send to the game warden when I got back to town. Nature would take care of what was left. The really strange stuff started later that afternoon. I was on the porch relaxing with a beer when a very odd feeling came over me. The woods around me had become very quiet. No birds were singing or anything. Slowly, I started to feel like I was being watched. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. The uneasiness began to weigh on me until I felt compelled to call out. No one moved or answered. This lasted for almost an hour. Gradually, the tension slowly lifted and the forest around me came back to life. It's an experience unlike any I've ever had. At dinner that night, I flipped through a book about Ozark wildlife we had on a shelf. My visitor had probably been a common deer, but black bear and mountain lions were also a possibility. The last two were said to be very rare in my neck of the woods. That being said, wildlife has its own set of rules and will go anywhere it pleases. I wasn't worried about the deer, but the others were very capable of killing me in a heartbeat. However, they also tend to be very shy of people. I had 3 days left of my stay. I figured if I kept my eyes peeled and stuck close to the cabin, I'd be relatively safe. And so that was my plan. Humans hadn't even crossed my mind despite just finding a kill the day before. As a rule, men are loud and easy to spot, and only a very seasoned woodsman can stay invisible in the forest. No matter the circumstances, I was determined to enjoy my remaining time, and I was up early the next day as usual. I'd had breakfast and was filling a bucket from the well when another crack came a second later, quickly followed by a ricocheting noise. That's when it clicked. I was being shot at. The noise was the sound of a suppressed rifle. I dove behind my truck, which was parked nearby. I was kicking myself for not recognizing it that first night. Even though silencers, as most of the world calls them, aren't super common, I do have friends that own them. They are used for hunting, but the practice is more common in Europe than here. Contrary to what the movies make you think, suppressors don't make your gun silent. Although they do drastically reduce the report of the gun, the actual action of the gun opening and closing makes a pretty loud clacking noise. None of that's important right now, though. Once I made it to cover, the shots stopped. I was unsure where they were coming from. I had no other choice but to try and escape some way. I was next to the truck, so that was the option I chose. As quietly as possible, I opened the driver's side door and crawled into the cab. I put the keys into the ignition and started the engine. I expected the shots to start again, but they didn't. I still wasn't willing to stick my head up and get it shut off. Luckily for me, I had a straight path to the road. I yanked the transmission into gear and pressed the gas pedal with my hand. The most I could do was hold the wheel straight and hope I didn't crash into a tree. It's not an easy way to drive, that's for sure. After I had gotten about 100 yards down the road, I quickly peeked over the dash. I didn't dare expose myself any longer than necessary. Any decent shot with a rifle could hit me at about 300 yards out without much trouble. I continued doing this until I was well out of range. At that point, I sat up into the seat and drove as fast as possible to the sheriff's station. When I arrived, I let them know that they had a crazed poacher sniper running loose. They were a lot calmer than I expected and far more prepared than I'd thought. The sheriff called in a nearby county to assist. They got together and planned out the operation quickly and in a very professional manner. I stood by a few miles away while they cleared the area. I was allowed in only after they were sure that he had fled. In my absence, he had shot the windows out of the cabin and there were several holes in the doors. I grabbed what I needed and returned home. It was all in the hands of law enforcement now. I was expecting a call within a few days updating me, but I heard nothing. After 2 weeks, I couldn't wait any longer. I contacted the sheriff and left a message. They called me back to say that they had yet to capture the subject, in those exact words. They had found signs of some old camps, but he hadn't been seen in almost a week. Missouri law enforcement has also been notified. They were monitoring their side of the border in case he crossed over into their state, and that was the last time I had any real information. I suspect they may know more about him than they're telling me. There are thousands of acres out there for him to hide in. If he's as experienced as I think, they may never find him. I check in every month or two and I'm always told that I'll be notified should anything change. And now that life has returned to normal, my cousins are planning to hunt the upcoming fall and spring seasons at the cabin. They went out to make repairs earlier this year and said they saw no sign of the guy in the area. For their sake, I hope the guy really is gone for good. And that's about all I can tell you. Until he's found, much of why he did what he did will remain a mystery. Our family vacation of 2018 would be the worst vacation of our entire lives. My first mistake was driving. In my mind, the whole ordeal would be easier if I did. I wasn't counting on my back acting up, and this made a 4-hour drive seem like an eternity. By the time we made it to Corpus Christi, I could barely walk. Most of my holiday was spent in bed watching TV. My wife did a great job handling the kids alone, but that doesn't mean everything was smooth sailing. Our second day there, she was wading in the ocean and stepped on a piece of glass. She would need 10 stitches in her big toe. No one in my family goes barefoot anywhere now. My 12-year-old son was the only one that got away unscathed. The wife and I have called him lucky ever since. Even after all this misfortune, none of us would be as unlucky as our daughter. Her terrible experience is the focus of this post. To make things simpler, I'll refer to her as Amelia. I don't think she'd appreciate me using her real name. The entire drive up, she'd been sullen and withdrawn. Had I been less focused on myself, I may have asked why. When she realized I wasn't going to be joining them on the beach, she wanted to stay in the room with me. My wife reluctantly agreed and left with our son. While I stared drowsily at the TV, I have a prescription for when my back decides to crap out, she frantically tapped away on her phone. For 3 days, all was well with the world. I dozed off at some point when I woke up, and Amelia was gone. I figured that she had gotten bored and joined her mother and brother on the beach. She was a responsible girl, or at least as responsible as a 16-year-old kid can be. I saw no reason to worry. I fell back asleep, and this time I was awakened by a pounding on the door, and it took me a few minutes to reach it. When I opened up, 2 police officers asked me my name and the name of my daughter. I went into full panic mode. I frantically started asking all kinds of questions. My mind was going in every direction possible. I was convinced something awful had happened to her. The officers were able to calm me down enough to explain that she was safe. About half an hour prior, she had been walking on the beach and discovered a body that apparently washed up. She reported it to a hotel employee and they called the police. They were there to notify us. I explained my situation and told them my wife was already down on the beach with our son. They left to find her, and I spent the better part of 30 minutes getting dressed. My wife and son were already on the scene when I arrived. Amelia was visibly shaken. I'm sure the experience was traumatic for her. Not long after, we were cleared to leave. We returned to the room and discussed what we should do, and it was quickly decided to end the vacation early. Because of my back, I would fly back with Amelia and my wife would return in the car with our son. We packed up and headed to the airport, and by dark we were back home, and this is when the process of healing finally began. Amelia had said very little on the flight back home. This was a different type of quiet. She didn't act pouty or entitled. A blank and boundless stare had taken its place. She was very clearly in a state of shock, but I knew this was not the time or place to discuss it. This behavior continued for several weeks. She had yet to say anything about what had occurred. My wife and I got her a counselor with whom she would gradually open up to. I'm happy to say that she's doing much better. Although these lockdowns and starting college made things more difficult, she was able to attend her sessions over Zoom, and thank God for technology. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. A few of you may be aware that I was engaged once before I met my current husband. In early 2000, I was working in IT for a company in Denver, and this is when I first met Mark. We flirted for several months before he got the nerve to ask me out. Our relationship quickly became serious. Later that year, I moved in with him. Only a few months after that, he proposed and I tearfully accepted. The stress of planning the wedding left us both overwhelmed. When the time came for us to take our vacations, we chose a campout in the Rockies. Flying anywhere made us both nervous. I picked out a spot about an hour away and we set up camp. We arrived late on our first day and stuck close to camp. After a quick breakfast the next morning, we went out on a hike. The trail was a bit grown over, but still usable. Neither of us brought any water or snacks for the journey, and I had very little knowledge of bushcraft. I don't recall Mark ever talking about it. As a pair, we would be hopeless if we ever got lost. So, as it often is, that's exactly what happened. I had picked the place because I'd heard about this awesome pair of waterfalls. I didn't know exactly where they were, but I knew that they were close. We could hear them faintly in the distance. The trail split off at this point. This new trail was even rougher, but to our ears it was in the direction of the falls. We followed it for a long time, but the sound never got any louder. I suggested that we go off to the left. We'd surely run into the falls or a trail that led to it. Mark was reluctant but agreed without argument. After 15 minutes of fighting our way through the trees, we finally ran into another, more developed trail. We were sure that we were back on track now. However, a mile or more later, we were no closer. We were both tired and just wanted to get back to camp. We turned around and followed the trail back a few miles. The assumption was we'd eventually run into the original trail that led back to the camp. There was no sign of it, but we weren't yet concerned. Another hour passed and we still hadn't intersected with the trail. And this was the moment that we knew that we were lost. The sound of water had faded long ago. I thought that we had just missed our turn. If we went back the way we came, we had to hit it. It was 2:15 p.m. when we turned around. The next time I looked at my watch, it was 3:25 and we were still no closer. And this is when the fear began to hit me. By that point in the day, everything was a jumble. I was tired, hungry, and most of all, very thirsty. Mark had become uncharacteristically quiet, and this made things even worse. I became a panicked, ranting mess. Mark had enough and screamed, "Shut up," in my face. And it worked. I sat down, shut up, and listened. Mark calmly laid out a plan. We could hear the falls again, and we had to be close. And we would follow the sound through the trees until we reached the falls. We would not take any trails or shortcuts. Logic dictated that we would have to run into them eventually. Once we made it there, we would stay and wait until another tourist arrived and follow them out. If it was dark when we arrived, we would spend the night there and wait until someone arrived the next morning. And that's just what we did. We would finally reach the falls just before dark, and I was so happy to have water. I forgot that we were lost for a while, and little did I know, the hardest part was ahead of us. A fire was out of the question. Everything was back at camp. Neither Mark nor I knew any other way to start one. We were curled up together and tried to sleep, and the hours seemed to pass like years. The night got colder and colder. No matter how close we got together, it was never enough to keep you warm, and I began to violently shiver. At some point, I could feel myself drifting off, and relief soon gave way to fear. A little voice inside of me said that if I fell asleep, I may not wake up. I turned over and started shaking Mark to wake him up. It was very hard. He was angry and asked what I was doing, and I told him my fears, but he didn't want to listen. He started drifting off again, but I wouldn't let him, and this made him furious. He flew into an angry rant about shivering or something keeping you alive. It made no sense, but it gave me an idea. I decided to make things worse by bringing up something we had long dropped, and this made Mark livid, and the fight went on for hours from there. I kept the fight going as long as I could. Mark eventually caught on and laid back down. We laughed about it and talked about our plans for the future. My idea turned out to backfire on us. We were so exhausted from the argument we couldn't stay awake. I fought the urge to sleep for as long as I could, but at some point, I slipped away. The next thing I remember is someone shaking me and yelling. I didn't want to wake up, but they kept at it until I had to. My eyes opened to the sun shining and a middle-aged man talking to me. My head ached more than it ever has, and my vision was blurry. I sat up and looked behind me. Mark was awake and looked as if though he felt like I did. We couldn't explain much other than we got lost. And just like Mark had planned, the gentleman and his wife walked us out and back to our camp. The trip was over. We packed as fast as we could and drove back to Denver, and we spent the rest of the trip under a big comforter and a bed. We probably should have chosen that from the start, and now I carry a lighter with me now whenever I go, and even if it's just a trip to the store, I never want to be that cold again. Never. An ill feeling between Mark and I spawned from that trip. Although it was never said, Mark seemed to hold a grudge against me afterwards. I had been the one who chose the location and suggested the shortcut in the woods. I'd also brought up something he believed was buried between us. It may have eaten away at him after he had time to think more about it. He made backhanded comments about me in that trip more than once. A few times he did it in front of our friends. And over time it drove a wedge between us and what led to our split. In late 2002, we went our separate ways and haven't spoken since. I harbor no ill will towards him, and I don't think he does toward me. That was a long time ago. It's not important. I mainly wanted to share my story to illustrate the importance of getting basic survival instruction and preparing for every possible emergency. I hope the seriousness of this situation drives the point home to you. Whether it's about wilderness survival or changing a tire, I discovered preparedness is always your best option. Get trained, and you'll never regret it. Many summers of my childhood were spent exploring my grandparents' sprawling farm down in Texas. It was the location of many life-changing events. I broke my first bone there, and I even had my first kiss there. And this post is about one of those life-changing events. My first 5 years were spent at home with my mom. When I began school, Mom took a part-time job as a bookkeeper. Summer vacation came around, and the economy dictated that Mom keep working. And without Mom around to watch me, I was shipped off to my dad's parents' place. A few years on, my cousins joined me on the farm. Dad's parents were more than happy to take us in. Any farm can use an extra hand or two. The boys were put to work with Grandpa Ray, and my female cousin worked just as hard beside Grandma Ida preparing the day's meals and cleaning. This may sound like a lot to put upon a group of kids, but I assure you, we had plenty of time to mess around. My first vacation, Grandpa Ray taught me how to swim in the stock pond by throwing me in. I picked it up really quick. You'll probably be arrested if you did that now. It's not something I would have done with my kids, but Grandpa Ray was an old Marine. He had no time to coddle anyone, but it was never done out of malice. The event I want to talk about happened when I was 10. It was the infamous summer of 1980. That year still holds the record in several areas for highest temperature. I know the day I have in mind was well over 100 degrees. Had the creek and pond not been almost dried up, we would have been swimming. Incidentally, the next year Grandpa Ray bought a big above-ground pool for us all. My cousin Wade and I spent most of the morning shading ourselves under the trampoline. The area hadn't seen rain in quite some time. A web of deep and dry cracks riddled the black dirt, and he and I were curious how deep the cracks went. So, we began to dig. We got maybe 6 inches down when Wade's little sister, Beth, came outside. She wanted to swing on the tire swing, but the limb which held the rope had broken. Since I was the oldest, I was nominated to climb the tree and retie the rope. I took the rope in my teeth, and Wade boosted me up to the first limb. It appeared strong enough, but it bent considerably when I put any weight on it. Another slightly larger limb was just above it. I pulled myself up onto it and shimmied about 3 or 4 feet. I felt confident enough to sit upright and tied some weird knot around the limb. I told Beth to pull down on the tire to test it, and it held. Satisfied, I turned around and began to crawl back to the trunk. I made it back about a foot when I heard a loud crack. I yelled out, "Oh God," and the limb gave way. I didn't see my life pass before me, but things did seem to go in slow motion. The crack and the separation of the limb from the trunk, Beth's blood-curdling scream, it all seemed to last so long. Just before I hit the ground, I thought this may mean that I wouldn't get hurt, and this was a stupid idea. I landed back down with my left arm between myself and the ground. The wind was knocked out of me and I blacked out. I wasn't out but maybe for a few seconds. When I opened my eyes, Grandpa Ray was already carrying me to their station wagon. He carefully laid me down in the back seat and raced to the hospital in town. I remember very little from the ride. I may have blacked out again, and the next thing I recall was being in the ER. The doctors and nurses coming and going. Grandpa Ray assured me that I was going to be okay. Grandma Ida arrived with my cousins an hour or so later, and I found out that I'd broken my arm and had a concussion. In my teens, I began to have problems with my back. They probably stemmed from that fall, too. The doctor said, had I fallen from a higher place, I probably would have fared much worse. Despite being doped out of my mind, the process of making the cast enchanted me, and I was held overnight for observation and released the next morning. I would spend the rest of the vacation digging more holes, among other things. I still had my cast the first week of school. All my friends signed it for me, and I wanted to keep it afterwards, but My mom got the nurse to throw it away because it stunk. I would spend another 4 summers on the farm before I was old enough to stay on my own. Grandma and Grandpa became a smaller and smaller part of my lives. They had both passed away before I realized how important they were to me. I'm happy to say that the farm is still in the family, although it's much smaller than it once was. Currently, Wade and his family are living there. I visit them anytime I happen to be in their neck of the woods. The craggy old oak tree remains. A tire swing still hangs from one of its massive limbs, and it's good to see no matter how things change, some things still manage to survive. Just yesterday, my mother and I received some news we'd hoped we'd never get. According to Brazilian and U.S. officials, a set of remains were discovered in a shallow grave near some small unnamed village. Several tests were done, including dental comparisons, and it has been determined that they belong to my oldest brother, Raphael. We had lost contact with him in late 2017. The story of what happened during that period still has a lot of holes that need to be filled, but this is what little we think we know. Growing up, Raphael had been very close to my father. When our father passed away from cancer when Raphael was 15, he lost his way. Much of his next 10 years were spent searching. At 25, he was more aimless than ever. A friend suggested he join the army, and this turned out to be a blessing. Surrounded by all sorts of strong male leaders, he learned to become his own man. After 2 combat deployments, he left the military in a far better state. He wasn't quite ready to give up helping others yet, though. He found a non-profit providing aid to indigenous groups throughout Central and South America. Raphael joined them and remained with them for 3 years. During this time, he made a lot of friends. Many he stayed in contact with when he returned to America. After he left the non-profit, he traveled the country and explored. He slept on friends' couches and worked odd jobs, and this is the point in which we lost contact with him. It wasn't out of the ordinary to go long periods not speaking to him. We were confident in his ability to take care of himself. And here's where I'm forced to go by second-hand information and assumptions. After not hearing from him for almost 6 months, Mom and I became concerned. We contacted every friend we knew of and got no real answers, at least not at first. A week went by and we received a call back from one of Raphael's co-workers with the aid group. Through another person, he was contacted and told Raphael that he had taken a vacation trip back to Brazil to see some friends. A man he met online joined him. The friends in Brazil verified that Raphael had visited them once and promised to return one more time before leaving the country. He had been accompanied by the unknown man, who himself was Brazilian. The friend said that he was very quiet and almost unfriendly toward them, and this is the last time anyone can verify him being alive. Nobody we've spoken to knows the identity of the man he'd taken with him on the trip. It was suggested that he was along to serve as a guide and interpreter, but most of his coworkers asserted that Raphael spoke Portuguese and a couple native languages relatively well. Not to mention, he knew his way around much of the country. Those places he wasn't aware of, he wouldn't have any problem finding willing locals to assist him. He was well known and liked, especially among many in the native community. And that's about the extent of what we can share with you. We are grateful to the authorities here and in Brazil for all the effort they put forward to bring our Raphael home to us. That said, I can't pretend to be happy with the result. To date, very little is known as to how he lost his life. The cause of death was ruled as undetermined. My hope is that the unknown Brazilian man will soon be identified, and he can fill in all the empty spots that currently exist. I'm afraid to say, until then, we are left with far more questions than answers. I want to thank all of those who helped us in our search and provided the information needed that led to the discovery of Raphael's body. Should any important updates arise, we will be sure to share them with you all here. I also want to thank everyone for their support in this terribly trying time. You have been a light when all around us seems so dark. I've discussed this with my wife. and we thought it may be good for me to finally tell my story. It would, at the very least, allow our children to know why their grandfather passed. I hope you understand why this process has been so difficult for me once you read it. That's my personal reason for doing this. I'm not the counseling type of guy. This will have to be my therapy. Now, with all that said, what follows is my memory of what happened that day. My dad was a quiet, serious, and no-nonsense man. If he didn't want to do something, nobody could make him do it, even if it kept you safe. Seatbelts were his number one pet peeve. He hated them and refused to wear them even though they were required. He'd been ticketed several times, but he continued to refuse. Mom even showed him statistics proving they kept you safe, but it fell on deaf ears. He was uncompromising and set in his ways, and this trait would end up being what killed him. The accident would occur on July 23, 1995. At the time, I was 12 years old. The family had taken a short camping trip to a lake on the Texas-Oklahoma border. It was the first and only vacation that we were going to have that year. The entire weekend had been one endless mess. It was miserably hot, and my sister got a severe sunburn. I think we all got devoured by bugs also. I know I couldn't stop scratching for weeks after. That morning we were driving back through Oklahoma. Everyone seemed to be driving ridiculously slow and dangerously. This was driving my dad crazy. He desperately wanted to get back home before dark. To add to the stress of the situation, I was picking on my sister and slapping her sunburnt shoulders. This made her scream like a banshee. Mom was doing her best to keep us in check. It made Dad even crazier than he already was. At some point, about halfway across the state, we got behind a truck. It was going fast enough, but the bed was stacked high with all types of junk. Dad paid it no concern. He was just happy to finally be going the speed limit, although knowing him, we were probably going way over it. The environment in the car had relaxed. I was listening to Metallica on my headphones, and everyone else was just sitting quietly. Dad had the radio turned down. Suddenly, something flew out of the bed of the truck. I looked up, and Dad was swerving out of control. He regained it just in time for the second collision. We slammed into the back of the truck, doing 50 at least. Rather than pull over, the truck stopped right in the middle of the highway. The next thing I remember was waking up in a lot of pain. The seatbelt had stopped me, but it did nothing to slow all the objects flying from the back of the car. My sister had also been struck and was very confused. Our mom was fussing over us and making sure we were okay. Everyone was relatively unhurt. Everyone but Dad. Mom looked over. She had an expression of horror on her face. She was sobbing and rubbing my dad's arms. And that was when I knew that he was gone. I had to look even if I didn't want to. I slowly unlocked my belt and leaned forward. His upper body was leaning onto the collapsed steering wheel. His head was turned facing my mom, and blood covered the windshield where his head had made contact. You could tell that he never saw it coming. It's the only comfort I carry with me until this day. Of course, the stubborn jerk just wasn't wearing a seatbelt. From then on, it's all a blur, really. Emergency services arrived and took us all to the hospital. The driver of the truck was fine, but for a sore neck. Family from Kansas City arrived later that evening, and we returned home with them the following day. As it always must, life for us carried on. Mom kept the family afloat until my sister and I went off to college, and she would eventually remarry a really good guy named Larry. Since I've become a father, it has been my primary goal to set a good example for my children. I love my dad, but he was a selfish man. If you have kids, be mindful of your own safety as well as your children's. It's your duty to be there to guide them into adulthood. If you're dead, you can't do that. But that's just my 2 cents. Thank you to all who took the time to read this, and I hope it helped you all as much as it helped me. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about all the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, sometimes we say nice things.